You were born in the waning light of a Mediterranean summer, in a modest house on the rugged island of Corsica. The year was 1769, and the island had just been sold, traded like a pawn in the game of empires, from Genoa to France. The Corsicans didn't forget. Neither did you. From the very beginning, your life was shaped by tension. The granite mountains of Corsica loomed like ancient gods, watching as your family, the Bonapartes, struggled to maintain their noble status under French dominion. You were Napoleon Bonaparte, son of Carlo and Letizia, born not with a silver spoon, but with a burning sense of identity. Corsican first, French never, at least not yet. Your father, a small-time lawyer and an opportunist of sorts, knew which way the wind was blowing. He pledged loyalty to the French to gain favor, sending you to the mainland for education. You were barely 9 when you left Ajaccio for the Royal Military Academy in Brienne. There, among the children of French aristocrats, your accent, your name, your skin, everything about you set you apart. They mocked you, but you endured. Because deep inside you were calculating. Brienne was cold in every sense. Weather, people, purpose, but you hardened. Books became your allies. Mathematics, history, strategy, you devoured them. While others played, you traced the campaigns of Caesar, Hannibal, and Alexander. The past whispered to you, greatness is carved, not inherited. You earned a place at the École Militaire in Paris. There you trained to be an artillery officer, precise, deliberate, deadly. You graduated a year early, not because you were a prodigy in the conventional sense, but because you had something more potent than genius: purpose. You became a lieutenant at 16, and while the French court basked in silk and scandal, you stared at maps and dreamed of fire. Then, the world cracked open. The Bastille fell. The streets of Paris choked with revolution. Heads rolled and monarchs trembled. For most, it was chaos. For you, it was opportunity. You watched the monarchy collapse like a crumbling fort. You saw generals defect, nobles flee, kings panic. But you stayed because you had no title to lose. You had only vision and hunger. In Corsica, your political alliances turned sour. You tried to bring revolution home, but Paoli, the Corsican nationalist hero you once idolized, turned against you. The island rejected you. You fled with your family, disgraced, homeless, landless, rootless. But France embraced the bold. In 1793 at Toulon, you proved yourself. The British held the port, and the French were desperate. You devised an audacious artillery plan. You aimed your cannons not just at ships, but at fate itself. The city fell, and so did all doubt. You were promoted to brigadier general at just 24. Paris took notice. So did Robespierre. And then Robespierre fell. The reign of terror ended in a river of blood. You were briefly imprisoned, suspected, tainted. But unlike others, you emerged alive and intact. Because you adapted, you always adapted. In 1795, royalists threatened Paris. The government panicked. They needed a soldier with iron nerves. They turned to you with a whiff of grape shot. You scattered the insurgents like dust. The Directory, the shaky post-revolution government owed you everything. You were given command of the Army of the Interior, then, soon after, the Army of Italy. Italy. A worn-out, half-starved command. But to you, it was a canvas. You didn't march to maintain order. You marched to conquer. In 1796, you crossed the Alps with a fury not seen since Hannibal. The Austrians scoffed, then bled. Piedmont fell. Milan opened its gates. The Pope begged for peace. You, still in your 20s, dictated terms to kings. And yet, it wasn't enough. Victory intoxicated you. But you didn't drink it idly. You bottled it, studied it, distilled it into strategy. In letters to Paris, You crafted your legend. Every skirmish became a triumph. Every win became a masterpiece. France didn't just love you, it needed you. While the generals squabbled and the politicians stumbled, you stood alone, decisive, charismatic, unstoppable. And so the next theater called. A grander campaign. Not in Europe, but beyond. A place of ancient sand and myth. You turned your eyes to the east, to Egypt, where Alexander had once trod, where Caesar had once wept, where you, Napoleon Bonaparte, would challenge not just empires, but time itself. And thus, as your ships set sail across the Mediterranean Sea, smoke of Italy still clinging to your coat, you felt it. The tide was shifting. History was yours to command. And when your boots touched the sands of Alexandria and the pyramids rose on the horizon like sleeping titans, you knew this was not merely conquest. This was destiny. You didn't come to Egypt just to fight. You came to immortalize yourself, to follow in the footsteps of Alexander the Great, to carve your own legend into the stone of antiquity. You brought with you not only cannons and cavalry, but scientists, artists, scholars, a traveling republic of ideas. You wanted to conquer the East and enlighten it all at once. The Battle of the Pyramids was swift and savage. Mamluk warriors, charged with medieval pride, but your lines held. You broke them with disciplined fire, with method and steel. You didn't just defeat them, you dismantled a centuries-old order. Cairo fell, not just to your army, but to your vision of modern war. But Egypt was not Europe. The desert didn't bend easily. The sun beat down like a curse, and the sands swallowed wheels, men, dreams. Then came the sea. While you fought on land, Horatio Nelson struck your fleet at Aboukir Bay. The French Navy, your tether to Europe, was shattered. You were trapped in Egypt, surrounded by hostile tribes, isolated by British guns. Still, you stayed, because retreat wasn't in your vocabulary. You turned adversity into theater. You crafted proclamations like poetry, turned every hardship into myth. You were Caesar in Africa, Alexander reborn. But the desert is not kind to illusion. Rebellion simmered, plague spread. And as your supplies dwindled, so did the glory. Then you heard whispers from France. The Directory, corrupt and crumbling, was failing. Austria stirred again. The Republic was flailing, headless, blind, weak. France needed a savior. You didn't hesitate. Leaving your army behind, you crossed the sea under the cloak of secrecy, dodging British patrols like a fugitive. When you landed in France, you were not a general returning from a failed campaign. You were a hero, a legend, a whirlwind wrapped in flesh. The people cheered, the politicians feared, but they also needed you. In November 1799, under flickering torchlight and the shadow of bayonets, you orchestrated your coup. The 18th of Brumaire, by the revolutionary calendar, marked the end of the Republic's chaos. You dissolved the Directory, seized power, and named yourself First Consul. They called it the end of liberty. You called it salvation. You restructured government, reformed the legal code, rebuilt the army. You weren't just a soldier now. You were an architect of order, of stability, of power. The people, weary of blood and instability, welcomed your firm hand. You promised them glory, and then you delivered. Austria rose again, trying to crush the Republic in its new form. So you marched through the Alps once more, this time with drama in every step. The great St. Bernard Pass, with its icy cliffs and treacherous paths, became your stage. And at Marengo, when the battle seemed lost, you turned defeat into triumph, with perfect timing and ruthless instinct. The map of Europe shifted again, by your hand, but war alone could not satisfy you now. You needed permanence. So in 1804, with the cathedral heavy with incense and expectation, you crowned yourself emperor, not the pope, not tradition. You placed the crown on your own head because you would not kneel, because this was not a borrowed legacy, it was yours. France became your empire, not through inheritance, but through will. You redesigned laws, reshaped institutions, reimagined the nation. You weren't just ruling, you were rebuilding civilization in your image. But even as the people adored you, the monarchs of Europe plotted. The old kings had seen enough. The British never ceased, the Austrians never yielded, and the Russians waited. The flames of revolution that once tore down the old world were now the fire of your ambition. And the world watched, breathless. You were no longer a Corsican boy, with maps and dreams. You were Napoleon, the storm that would sweep across Europe, and the next war, the next challenge, was already rising. Across the Rhine, across the snows, across the heart of the continent. You turned eastward, toward Austria, Russia, and the heart of empire itself. You had crowned yourself emperor, but now the world would decide if your crown was iron or glass. The coronation was spectacle, yes, robes, incense, Latin chants echoing through Notre Dame, but the real ritual was always war. The old monarchies of Europe were not content to watch you sit upon a throne built by revolution. They conspired, whispered across drawing rooms and ballrooms, binding themselves into the Third Coalition. Britain, Austria, Russia, reluctant allies, uneasy bedfellows, yet united in their fear of one man. You. The storm gathered fast. Austria moved first, crossing the Danube with the confidence of old empires. Russia followed, its massive armies marching westward like a glacier tipped in steel. Your enemies believed you were isolated, your armies scattered, your empire vulnerable. They wanted to smother you before your fire grew too wild, but you were already moving. With breathtaking speed, you redrew the map with your boots. The Grande Armée, forged in the fires of discipline and loyalty, became an extension of your will. You turned a campaign that should have taken months into weeks. Across the Rhine, through Bavaria, your soldiers marched like phantoms, swift, silent, relentless. The enemy didn't find an exposed France. They found an encircling shadow. At Ulm, the first blow fell. You caught the Austrian General Mack in a trap so perfect, it became legend. Surrounded and bewildered, his army surrendered without a battle of glory. Thousands of men, weapons, wagons, banners, all yours without firing a shot. But the coalition did not shatter. They doubled down. Russia had arrived. Tsar Alexander, young and proud, joined with Emperor Francis of Austria, believing together they could crush you. They had numbers, position, prestige. You had vision. You led your army deeper, farther, toward Moravia, toward a small village whose name would soon echo across centuries, Austerlitz. It was December. Cold fog clung to the valleys. Snow whispered, "Over the hills." Your men, exhausted but devoted, had marched for weeks. You read the land like a general, but also like an artist. You saw not terrain, but potential. You wanted the enemy to think you were weak, so you staged it. Your right flank looking exposed, your forces stretched thin. You wanted them to attack. The trap was sublime. On the morning of December the 2nd, the anniversary of your coronation, the sun broke through the mist in golden shafts. The sun of Austerlitz, they would call it. Your enemies, swollen with confidence, surged forward, exactly as you planned. They struck at your right, just where you left it vulnerable. And then, as they overcommitted, you did what only you could. You struck at the center, like a dagger thrust, into the ribs. Your corps under Soult charged through the Pratzen Heights, splitting the Allied armies like timber under an axe. Confusion followed. Chaos. The Tsar's guards reeled. The Austrians stumbled. The battlefield turned into a dance of destruction, and you, calm, calculating, watched it unfold from a hillside like a conductor directing the symphony of war. By nightfall, The enemy was broken. Thousands lay dead or wounded. More surrendered. Cannons were captured. Eagles seized. The coalition shattered like brittle glass under the weight of your genius. You called it your finest hour. The rest of Europe called it a warning. You didn't stop to bask. You pressed your advantage. In the weeks that followed, Austria sued for peace. The Treaty of Pressburg redrew the continent again. Venice, Bavaria, Württemberg, all were now aligned with your empire. The Holy Roman Empire itself, a relic of 1,000 years, was effectively dead. You had killed it, not with rhetoric, but with bayonets. But Britain would not kneel. While you conquered on land, they ruled the seas. At Trafalgar, Admiral Nelson defeated your fleet, ensuring that your empire would have boundaries. You would never cross the Channel, never bring your legions to London. It stung, yes, but you adapted. If you could not destroy Britain by arms, then by economics. You devised the continental system, a blockade of trade across Europe. No British goods, no English ships. You turned the continent into a fortress of tariffs and embargoes, a wall of resistance. It was economic warfare, total and unrelenting, but walls can crack, and empires strain under pressure. Your enemies learned. They evolved. Russia, once broken, began to rebuild. Prussia, once passive, began to prepare. And Spain, ancient and proud, would soon become a battlefield drenched in blood. But in this moment, after Austerlitz, with Europe kneeling, you stood unchallenged. You were not merely an emperor. You were the arbiter of history. And the next chapter of that history, written in fire, in betrayal, in revolution, would begin not on a battlefield, but in the twisting alleys of Madrid, where resistance would spark a fire even you couldn't control. You had stood upon the summit of Europe. Kings trembled at your name. Treaties bore your seal. And yet, even at the height of your power, it was the seeds of your own ambition that began to crack the earth beneath you. Spain had been an ally, a decrepit kingdom ruled by a tottering Charles IV and his conniving son, Ferdinand. Their court was a nest of vipers, corruption, incompetence, whispers of treason. You looked south and saw not a sovereign nation, but an opportunity. You called it diplomacy. Others would call it betrayal. You lured the Spanish royal family to Bayonne. There, under the weight of your presence, Charles abdicated. Ferdinand yielded. You placed your brother Joseph on the Spanish throne, not by the will of the people, but by imperial decree. What you failed to see, what even your genius could not calculate, was the fire that burned in the Spanish soul. Madrid erupted first. The Dos de Mayo uprising was not an army. It was civilians, shopkeepers, farmers, women throwing oil from balconies, peasants with pitchforks, knives, whatever they could grasp. They rose not for politics, but for pride. And when your soldiers responded with gunfire, with sabers, with mass executions, the fire only spread. You thought the Spanish would accept Joseph, as other nations had accepted your order. But Spain was not Bavaria. It was not Italy. It was ancient and wild and proud. The more you pressed, the more it resisted. Guerrilla little war. That word, born in the hills of Spain, would become your nightmare. Your legions faced no grand army, no formations to crush with cavalry and cannon. Instead, your men marched through narrow roads and were picked off by invisible hands. Bridges collapsed behind them. Supplies vanished. Messengers were strangled in the night. What should have been a swift pacification became a war without rules. The British saw their chance. Arthur Wellesley, soon to be Duke of Wellington, landed in Portugal. A quiet, calculating man, he lacked your flamboyance but possessed steel. He fortified, he trained, he maneuvered. Slowly, methodically, he turned the Iberian Peninsula into a bleeding wound you could not cauterize. You sent your best, Soult, Massena, nay, but the Spanish terrain consumed them. For every village they captured, 10 more resisted. For every guerrilla hanged, 100 took up arms. The people had become the war. Meanwhile, your empire strained. The continental system, your economic wall against Britain, was crumbling. Smuggling thrived. Neutral nations balked. Russia grumbled. Even your allies grew restless. To enforce your will, you needed total obedience. And so, like a gambler doubling down, you turned east. In 1809, Austria struck again, hoping to catch you distracted. But you answered. You marched on Vienna once more. At Aspern-Essling, the Austrians dealt you your first real check, a defeat that shook your aura of invincibility. But it was temporary. At Wagram, you struck back, hard. You forced Austria to its knees again, reshaping the map further in your image. You believed victory could still erase the cracks. You even secured marriage with Marie-Louise, daughter of the Austrian emperor. She was young, royal, fertile, the antithesis of Josephine. In time, she would bear you a son, the King of Rome. Your dynasty, you believed, was secure, but Spain remained unresolved. Like a dagger left lodged in your side, it bled you slowly. Years passed. Your army bogged down. Your image eroded. Once, you were the liberator of peoples. Now, to many, you were the foreign tyrant. Every Spanish village became a potential battlefield. Every peasant, a potential killer. The war became a quagmire, a swamp of honor and blood, and Britain only grew stronger. Wellington advanced. Fortress by fortress, mile by mile, he drove your forces back. What began as a minor front now consumed tens of thousands of your best soldiers. Resources you needed elsewhere were buried in the Spanish earth. You had once mastered war with speed, with boldness, but Spain taught you that sometimes even a genius cannot outmarch a people's will. Yet you refused to admit defeat. Instead, you turned your eyes farther still, to the east, to the snows, to Russia. You believed that one final, decisive campaign could restore your grip on history. You did not know that the road to Moscow would become the graveyard of empires. You believed that destiny still lay ahead, that the failures in Spain were but a distraction, that the empire, your empire, could yet be solidified with one thunderous act. And so, in the year 1812, you turned east, toward the vastness, the frost, the enigma that was Russia. Alexandra had once been your friend, your reluctant partner after Tilsit, but friendship, in your world, was fleeting. The continental system you enforced choked Russia's trade, strangled its economy, and Alexander, proud and imperial in his own right, chafed under your shadow. He opened his ports to Britain. He defied your demands. He made himself a problem, and you did not tolerate problems. So you assembled the greatest army Europe had ever seen. Over 600,000 men marched under your banner, French, Poles, Germans, Italians, Dutch, even reluctant Austrians. You called it the Grande Armée, but it was more a continent than an army, a human tide stretching across the steppes. You thought you would win quickly, a decisive battle, force the Tsar to kneel, rewrite the order of Europe again. You had done it before. Why not again? But Russia was unlike any enemy you had faced. It did not play by the rules. The Russians did not meet you in open battle. Instead, they retreated, burned villages, poisoned wells, left you nothing but scorched earth and silence. Your army advanced, yes, but with every mile it starved a little more. The heat of summer gave way to dust, and dust to fatigue. Supply lines stretched like thin strings across hostile land. Roads turned to mud, horses died, men fell ill. The land itself rejected you. Still you marched. You reached the river Niemen, then Vilnius, then Smolensk. But each time you expected a stand, the Russians vanished again, deeper into the continent. Finally, at Borodino, they stopped running. There, on the plains outside Moscow, you faced the full weight of Russian resistance. Kutuzov, the old general with cold eyes and patient resolve, arranged his forces in lines of earthworks and artillery. Over 250,000 men clashed that day. You called it a victory. The Russians called it survival. It was a victory like no other, bloody, bitter, and hollow. You took the field, yes, but at what cost? 40,000 of your men lay dead or dying. The path to Moscow was open, but your army was broken. Still, you pressed on. You entered Moscow expecting a triumph. You expected envoys, keys to the city, perhaps even a peace offering. Instead, you found silence. The city was empty, deserted, by civilians, abandoned by soldiers. And then it began to burn. Whether by arson or accident, it did not matter. Moscow burned for days. Smoke choked the skies. Flames consumed homes, churches, palaces. What had been your prize became a ruin. You waited for Alexander to sue for peace, but no offer came. Weeks passed. Autumn crept in. Your supplies dwindled. Your men scavenged among ashes. Winter approached, and still no surrender. And so, with frost clinging to your boots, you made the hardest decision of your life. You ordered the retreat. What followed was not a march, but a death sentence. The snow fell, soft at first, then blinding, endless. Temperatures dropped below freezing. Horses froze where they stood. Wagons shattered. Men wrapped themselves in rags and still died by the thousands. Frostbite turned fingers black. Eyelids stuck together from ice. Bread became stone. Water froze. Solid. You had not prepared for this. No one had. And the Russians, now emboldened, circled like wolves. Cossacks struck with terrifying speed, killing, vanishing. Roads became ambushes. Rivers swallowed whole columns. Soldiers fell behind and were never seen again. At the Berezina River, you faced annihilation. The ice-choked waters barred your path. Russian forces closed in. You ordered bridges built in desperation. Thousands were trampled, drowned, abandoned. But somehow, miraculously, you escaped. You crossed into friendly territory with perhaps 30,000 men. From 600,000 to 30, the Grande Armée was no more. It had dissolved into snow and bones. You returned to Paris before word reached the capital. You claimed you had the situation under control, that the campaign had been a strategic withdrawal. But even your charisma, even your legend could not erase the truth. Europe had seen you bleed, and they would never forget it. The Russian campaign was more than a defeat. It was the turning point. The myth of your invincibility shattered like ice beneath cavalry hooves. The alliances you once held by fear began to unravel, and across the continent, old enemies stirred. Prussia, Austria, Sweden, Britain, even tiny German states. All of them smelled blood. The emperor had stumbled, and now the vultures began to circle. But you, Napoleon, were not yet finished. Your genius had not faded. Your ambition had not dulled. You had risen once before. You would rise again. At least that is what you told yourself, as the smoke of Russia still clung to your cloak. You returned to Paris not as a victor, but as a survivor. The Russian frost still clung to your coat. The screams of the dying still echoed in your dreams. But you could not show weakness. You could not afford regret. So you did what you always did when surrounded by ruin. You rebuilt. Within weeks, you summoned a new army. Boys, old men, raw recruits. They became soldiers by your command. You called them forth by the tens of thousands, forging steel from ash. France bled, but still it gave you men. Still they followed. But across the continent, the world was changing. Your enemies had seen the impossible. The Grande Armée shattered. You, the master of Europe, forced to flee across frozen rivers like a hunted animal. The aura of your invincibility had cracked, and through that crack, the nations rushed in like floodwater. They formed the Sixth Coalition: Russia, Prussia, Britain, Sweden, Spain, Austria. Even once loyal German states now turned against you. Old grudges returned like ghosts. You had humiliated them for years. Now they hungered for revenge. They raised armies. They armed civilians. They brought the war to your doorstep. You marched again, this time to Germany, to face the new coalition. But this war was different. No more quick campaigns. No more swift conquests. This was attrition, grinding, unrelenting, bloody. At Lutzen and Bautzen, you won, but barely. These were not the sweeping victories of Austerlitz or Jena. They were costly, uncertain. Your men fought like lions, but your lions were tired, underfed, outnumbered. You could no longer afford mistakes, and the coalition had learned. They avoided direct battles. They cut your supply lines. They used speed, numbers, terrain. British gold funded their armies. Russian tactics burned their own land to trap you. Austrian diplomacy unraveled your alliances. You were brilliant, but you were alone. And then came Leipzig, the Battle of the Nations. It was the largest battle Europe had ever seen, over 600,000 soldiers across a battlefield stretching for miles. For 3 days, thunder shook the ground. Cavalry charges, cannonades, rivers of blood. You stood at the center, issuing commands, defying fate. But the tide had turned. Your allies betrayed you. Saxon troops switched sides mid-battle. Bridges collapsed under retreating forces. Thousands drowned in the Elster River. What began as a battle became a catastrophe. You fled with the remains of your army, and this time, there would be no pause. The coalition pursued relentlessly. They marched through Germany, liberating city after city. Then Switzerland, the Netherlands, northern Italy, all slipping from your grasp. The Rhine, once the proud border of your empire, now marked your retreat. Inside France, the people wavered. Some still believed in you. Others whispered that perhaps it was time to end the wars. Time to let the emperor go. You tried to rally them. You gave speeches. You summoned every last battalion. You rode to the front again, just as you had when you were young. You looked into the eyes of boys, barely old enough to shave, and promised them glory. But the coalition entered France. 14. Winter again. The enemy was in your homeland. You fought them like a wounded lion. At Brienne, La Rotière, Montmirail, Montereau, you led daring counterattacks. You outmaneuvered larger forces. You defeated armies 4 times your size. The genius was still there. The fire still burned. But it was not enough. They kept coming. 10 enemies for every friend. 10 guns for every one of yours. Every mile you recaptured was lost again within days. The coalition pressed toward Paris, step by step, farm by farm. And then Paris fell. You were still fighting when they entered the city, still planning one last maneuver. But while you drafted orders, the gates opened. Talleyrand, your once loyal diplomat, had turned. He negotiated your surrender behind your back. Your marshals, Ney, Marmont, Berthier, came to you. Their eyes hollow, their uniforms stained with mud. "It is over," they said. You refused to believe it. You still had men, you still had courage, but no one would follow. Not this time. And so, in a quiet room in Fontainebleau, surrounded by former friends now weary of war, you did the unthinkable. You abdicated. They gave you a pen. You signed your name. And with that, the empire ended. France would become a monarchy again. The Bourbons, exiled for decades, would return to rule. Louis XVI would wear the crown you had seized by ambition and brilliance. You were exiled. to the tiny island of Elba off the coast of Italy, a kingdom in miniature. You were given the title Emperor still, but of a rock, not an empire. They thought you finished. They thought the story had ended, but you were Napoleon, and you were not done. They sent you to Elba with a mock crown and a mock court. A tiny island, 12 kilometers long, far from the thrones of Europe you once dominated. They gave you soldiers, 600 men, and a flag of your own design. They thought this would be your tomb, quiet and controlled, where the memory of Napoleon could wither without danger. But they had misunderstood you. Again, you, who had once ruled half of Europe, did not crumble in exile. You observed, you planned, you listened. You heard of the corruption in Paris, of the old Bourbon king returned to a throne he no longer understood. You watched as the people grumbled under Louis XVI, as veterans of your campaigns were dismissed, humiliated. Your name, though forbidden, passed in secret from mouth to mouth, tavern to tavern, soldier to soldier. They had not forgotten. You were not defeated. You were only waiting. And then the moment came. On the night of February 26, 1815, you boarded a small brig, L'Inconstant, with your loyal guard. No fanfare, no grand ceremony, just a single cannon fired and sails turned north. The wind was at your back. You landed near Golfe-Juan, a quiet beach in southern France. No army met you, no resistance. Just startled fishermen and farmers who blinked in disbelief at the man who had once commanded Europe. You began to march north, always north, toward Paris. No weapons drawn, no cities burned, but with every step, the word spread. Napoleon has returned. Louis XVI panicked. He sent troops to intercept you. He believed they would arrest you, deliver you in chains. But you knew better. These were your men. At Laffrey, it happened. A line of royal soldiers blocked the road. You rode ahead alone, dismounted, and walked. Into range, you opened your coat. "If any of you will shoot your emperor," you shouted, "here I am." No one fired. Instead, they dropped their rifles and ran to you, cheering. The Royal Army became yours again. Regiment by regiment, battalion by battalion, they defected. You did not need to fight. They came to you willingly. The people lined the roads, throwing flowers. Church bells rang. Veterans wept. You entered Lyon as a liberator. You reached Paris. On March 20th, Louis XVI had already fled in the night. The streets thundered your name again, Vive l'Empereur. For the second time, you seized power without firing a shot. The world reeled. Kings and emperors who had celebrated your fall now watched in horror. The man they had caged on a rock had returned like a phoenix. They gathered again, quickly, the Seventh Coalition, and vowed to finish what they started. But you had only 100 days. 100 days to rebuild an army. 100 days to face all of Europe. And you did not hesitate. Your plan was bold. Before the coalition could unite, you would strike first, into Belgium, where British and Prussian armies had not yet combined. You would crush them before reinforcements arrived. You gathered 124,000 men, less than you once commanded, but still formidable. Veterans returned, weapons were reforged, drums beat once more. And on June 12, 1815, you crossed the border for one final campaign. This was not the old Napoleon of Austerlitz, young and invincible. This was a man older, hardened by defeat, but still brilliant, still unyielding. You moved quickly, splitting your forces to drive wedges between the enemy. At Ligny, you defeated the Prussians under Blücher. It was a hard fight, brutal and close, but you drove them back. You believed them. Broken. You were wrong. Meanwhile, your other forces engaged the British under Wellington near a small village named Quatre Bras. The battle was inconclusive. The field was muddy, confused. But you believed you had bought enough time. You turned toward Waterloo, June 18th, gray skies, soft ground from days of rain. You faced Wellington's army, dug in along a ridge near the Mont Saint-Jean escarpment. You prepared your lines, you studied the terrain, and at 11:30 a.m. you ordered the first assault. Cannon fire shook the earth. Infantry moved like waves. Your men fought bravely, storming British positions again and again. You threw your elite cavalry forward, magnificent charges, galloping steel into gunfire, but they could not break through. The ground betrayed you. Rain turned fields into swamps. Artillery stuck, wagons stalled. Every advantage you once held, speed, coordination, surprise, was dulled by mud and misjudgment. Still, you believed you could win. At 7:08 p.m., you ordered your final gambit. La Garde Impériale, your most trusted, veterans, the old guard. They marched forward, tall and proud, the symbol of your legacy. But the British held firm. And then, from the east, a dark line appeared on the horizon, Blücher and the Prussian army arriving after all. Your right flank collapsed. Panic spread like wildfire. Cries turned into screams. Cannons were abandoned. Horses bolted. The mighty Grande Armée, your last, began to disintegrate. You refused to flee. You rode into the chaos, trying to rally your men, but it was too late. The battlefield was lost. You had gambled and lost everything. That night, in a farmhouse lit only by candlelight, you knew it was over. No exile could erase this defeat. You returned to Paris once more, not as a conqueror, not as a hero, but as a man with no future. The politicians turned their backs. The army dissolved. France had no appetite for more war, and so just days later, you abdicated again, this time forever. You had lost everything, again. But this time, there would be no daring return, no sudden reversal of fate. No one would greet you with flowers, no soldiers would chant your name, no trumpets would call the eagles back. The dream was over. After Waterloo, you returned to Paris a broken emperor, not defeated in spirit, but abandoned by the very nation you had once lifted to greatness. The chambers of power had turned cold, your supporters scattered. The army you once shaped into a weapon of legend, now dissolved like smoke. And yet, even now, you sought a path forward. You considered escape. America, perhaps. A ship was ready. You lingered on the coast, watching the horizon, wondering if freedom still waited beyond the Atlantic. But the British had already closed the sea. Their ships patrolled every bay, every cove. So you made a final move. On July 15, 1815, you boarded the Bellerophon, a British warship anchored off the port of Rochefort. You surrendered, not to France, not to Austria or Prussia, but to England, the nation you had long called your enemy. You believed they would grant you asylum, perhaps in some quiet corner of Britain or a distant colony. You even penned a letter to the Prince Regent, calling yourself a Themistocles among you, a fallen warrior seeking the mercy of a noble foe. But they would offer no honor, no quarter. You had shaken Europe too deeply. They could not risk your return again, so they chose a prison no man could escape. St. Helena, a lonely volcanic rock in the middle of the South Atlantic, 1,100 kilometers from the nearest landmass. No ports, no cities, just wind, sea, and jagged cliffs. A place where even the idea of return was impossible. You arrived there on October 15, 1815, under a stormy sky. Rain lashed the deck as the British guards escorted you ashore. There were no fanfares, no crowds, only seagulls and soldiers. You were 46 years old, still sharp of mind, but already a shadow of the man who once surveyed Europe from the heights of empire. They gave you a house, Longwood they called it, a damp, wind-blown estate on a plateau, ringed by watchtowers. The walls were thin. The rooms were cold. Mold grew in the corners and rats skittered beneath the floorboards. It was not a home. It was a cell. Your jailer was Sir Hudson Lowe, a man you despised, and who returned the sentiment tenfold. He monitored your every move, censored your letters, cut off your access to books, newspapers, even friendly visitors. He would not allow you to die a martyr or to live as a legend. You were alone, but still, you resisted. You surrounded yourself with a few loyal companions, Las Casas, Gourgaud, Montholon, and Bertrand. You dictated your memoirs, page after page, pouring your mind into ink. You rewrote your life, your legacy, transforming defeat into dignity, exile into epic. You spoke for hours each day, painting portraits of past glories, Austerlitz, Jena, Wagram, each victory recounted with fire and precision. You described the revolution, the Code Civil, the reordering of Europe under reason and will, and you spoke of the betrayal, of the kings who feared the light of change, of the English hypocrisy, of the cruelty of St. Helena. The world began to listen. Your words escaped the island, smuggled in secret, published across Europe, translated, reprinted. The legend of Napoleon began to grow again, not as emperor, but as martyr of progress, a titan brought low by the cowardice of kings. But your body, even as your myth swelled, began to fail. The climate took its toll. The wind gnawed at your bones. You developed ulcers, fevers, pain in your stomach that worsened each year. Your once powerful frame withered. You walked the damp halls of Longwood wrapped in greatcoats, shivering even under the sun, and yet your mind burned on. You still debated strategy with your companions, still reviewed maps, still recited Caesar and Tacitus. You followed the stars, wrote poetry, designed imaginary campaigns, anything to stay alive, not in body, but in spirit. You saw your son only in dreams. Napoleon II, the child they called the King of Rome, was far away in Vienna, a pawn in Austrian politics. You wrote letters to him, filled with advice, warnings, love, but they were never delivered. He grew up without you, under foreign tutors, in cold palaces where your name was whispered, not spoken aloud. You would never see him again. And then, the pain grew worse. By 1820, you could no longer ride. Your walks shortened. Meals became agonies. You vomited often. You lay awake, sweating, mumbling fragments of old orders, of lost campaigns, of vanished friends. Las Casas was gone. Gourgaud, too. Montholon and Bertrand remained, but even they could not stop the decline. Your hair fell, your skin grew pale, the fire dimmed. And on May 5th, 1821, as the wind howled outside and waves crashed far below the cliffs, you whispered your final words. France, armée, tête d'armée. France, army, head of the army, that was all. You were buried on St. Helena under a simple gravestone with no name, only the inscription, Chi Git, here lies. They feared your name even in death, but they could not bury your legend. News of your death spread slowly, carried across oceans by wind and sail. At first, silence, then a flicker, then a flame. Poets wrote of you, artists painted you. The people, who once cursed your wars, now wept at your exile. The Napoleonic myth, forged in battle and sealed in solitude, began to rise. In France, your enemies ruled, but even they could not erase you. The tricolor returned. Veterans gathered in secret. Your name, once forbidden, now echoed again in cafes and drawing rooms, whispered with reverence. And then, 20 years later, the impossible happened. In 1840, your remains were exhumed from St. Helena and brought back to France. A grand procession carried you through Paris, across the very boulevards you had once commanded. The people lined the streets by the thousands. Some sobbed, some knelt, You were no longer a usurper. You were a son of France. You were buried under the great dome of Les Invalides, surrounded by columns and marble and silence. The little Corsican artillery officer who had crowned himself emperor now rested as a giant. Not merely a man, but a symbol of ambition, of change, of vision taken to its greatest and most dangerous extreme. You sit quietly in the grand hall beneath the golden dome of Les Invalides, the final resting place of an emperor who once dreamed of conquering the world. But the story doesn't end with death or exile. It's only beginning. Because what you left behind, the wars, the reforms, the upheavals, shaped not just France, but the very fabric of Europe. You transformed armies into instruments of merit rather than privilege. You broke the chains of the old aristocracy and spread ideas born of the revolution. Equality before the law, secular governance, nationalism. The Napoleonic Code, your greatest legal legacy, became a foundation for modern civil law in many countries. It ensured property rights, abolished feudal privileges, and codified individual freedoms. Even today, your influence echoes in courtrooms from France to Louisiana, from Italy to Quebec. But your impact was not only legal or political. You ignited the spirit of nationalism across Europe. In the lands you conquered, the people began to see themselves not as subjects of distant kings, but as citizens of nations. Italy, Germany, Poland, all stirred with dreams of unity and self-rule, inspired in part by your campaigns. Yet, you also awakened fierce resistance. The Congress of Vienna in 1815 sought to restore the old order and suppress revolutionary ideas. But your conquests had loosened the grip of monarchies forever. The seeds of liberalism and nationalism you sowed would later grow into movements that reshaped Europe throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. You changed warfare itself. The speed and scale of your armies, the use of conscription, and your tactics revolutionized military strategy. Future generals studied your campaigns to understand how one man's vision could shake the world. But with great power came great destruction. Your wars cost millions of lives, devastated entire regions, and left scars that would take generations to heal. The balance of power in Europe was forever altered, sometimes in dangerous and unpredictable ways. And what of France itself? You left a France more centralized, more modern, and more unified than ever before. The administrative reforms you implemented streamlined government, education, and finance. You built roads, canals, and institutions designed to strengthen the state. But the price was high. The constant wars drained the treasury and strained the people. Your empire was built on both glory and suffering, and yet your memory never faded. Through the turbulent years after your death, your name became a rallying cry, sometimes for revolutionaries, sometimes for monarchists, and sometimes for those seeking a strong hand in troubled times. Kings feared your legacy. Republicans admired your ideals. Soldiers revered your genius. Your image appeared on coins, in paintings, and even in poetry. The legend of the Little Corporal grew into something larger than life. You became not just a man, but an idea, the embodiment of ambition, brilliance, and the costs of power. In schools, your battles are still studied. In museums, your artifacts are treasured. In the streets of Paris, your name adorns avenues and monuments. You changed Europe forever. And now, as you rest in your tomb, your spirit watches over the continent you once tried to unite. Sometimes in peace, sometimes in conflict, but always under the shadow of your legacy. Your story is a reminder that history is not only written by victors, but by those who dare to reshape the world. You've journeyed through thunderous battles, triumphant coronations, exile on a remote island, and a legacy that still echoes across continents. But who were you beyond the myths and the empire? You were not merely the Emperor Napoleon, the strategist, the ruler, the conqueror. You were also a man of contradictions, driven by ambition yet vulnerable to doubt, fierce yet capable of tenderness, ruthless yet longing for legacy. Born on the rugged island of Corsica, you came into the world far from the gilded courts of Europe. Your early years were marked by struggle and a fierce desire to prove yourself. You were the outsider, the little corporal, whose name would one day be feared and revered. You mastered languages, history, and mathematics. You absorbed the ideas of the Enlightenment and Revolution. You dreamed not just of power, but of remaking society, of ending the chaos that had fractured France, but power changed you. The boy who once fought for the Republic became a self-crowned emperor. Your dreams grew grander, and your methods harsher. You demanded loyalty, but distrusted those around you. You trusted your generals, but always kept a watchful eye. You could inspire armies to march across continents and then crush dissent at home with an iron fist. Yet you also showed humanity. Your love for Josephine, your care for your family, your moments of reflection during exile, all reveal a man wrestling with his own destiny, and your vision extended beyond France. You believed in progress, in law and order, in a Europe united by shared ideals rather than dynasties. You fought not only for territory but for ideas, some that would shape the modern world. Still, your downfall reminds us how fleeting power can be. You learned the cost of hubris and the price of war. You saw how quickly allies become enemies, how empires can crumble under their own weight. But your story endures because you dared to dream and dared to act on those dreams. Today, historians debate your legacy. Was you a tyrant or a hero? A liberator or a warmonger? The answer is complex, layered as the man himself. What cannot be denied is the mark you left on history, a mark of fire and shadow, glory and tragedy. As you lie beneath the stones of Les Invalides, your story invites us to reflect on power, ambition, and the human spirit. You remind us that even the smallest man can shake the world, that the course of history can hinge on the will of one, and that legends, like men, are forged in the crucible of their times, never perfect, always powerful. So, now, the curtain falls on your tale, but your echo will ring through the ages, because the world still remembers the little emperor who dared to stand tall and change the fate of Europe forever.